Okay. Welcome, everybody. We'll be joining the webinar shortly. Thank you. It keeps jumping. All right, we'll get started. Thank you all for joining our webinar, Gaining Certainty in Uncertain Times. We're excited for a lively discussion with Anshu Prasad, CEO and co-founder of Leaf, as well as our guest speaker, George Lawrie, supply chain analyst at Forrester. I'll give a little bit of background on you two, and then we'll get into it. And I'd also ask if you have any questions, please place them in the chat. We'll have a question and answer section at the end, so we'll get to your questions. And please feel free to reach out to us at hello@leaflogistics.com afterwards if you have any further questions. So I'm pleased to introduce George Lawrie. George is a member of Forrester's advanced manufacturing team. He publishes research on supply chain and product lifestyle management platforms that empower chief operating officers and vice presidents of supply chains to transform their enterprises within the automotive, aerospace, defense, high-tech, and life science industries. Before joining Forrester in 2003, George worked for software vendors and consulting companies in supply chain application development, implementation, and product management roles. He is a CIMA qualified accountant and holds a master's degree in operations research from Warwick University. Welcome, George.
Thank you.
And Anshu is CEO and co-founder of Leaf Logistics, which is a data-driven transportation grid that coordinates industry participants to eliminate waste. Prior to Leaf, he built and led Kearney's global analytics practice, helping clients utilize technology and data for business transformation. He also helped start and grow technology and analytics businesses, building teams in the US, Europe, and Asia. Welcome, Anshu.
Thank you.
Great. So first up, George is going to share with us some of his research on understanding what is going on in the transportation industry and some learnings for shippers.
Great. Thanks very much. So thank you for joining me in this session about how can we generate some kind of certainty in these uncertain times? So how can we mitigate all the turbulence that we're seeing? And let's think about turbulence. We'll think about the root causes. We'll think about what shippers should consider. And we get a glimpse of a future of supply chain. And then I'm going to be so bold as to say how you might get started on your transformation. Let's go ahead and look at these root causes. I think the first thing really is the fragmentation of the industry. Most people know that particularly road transportation is highly fragmented. There's a deep lack of automation. It's really if you go into transportation office, and I'm sure you've seen this, there's a lot of people on phones and using spreadsheets. It's not really well served with automation. And one of the results of that is that there's a massive hidden and poorly used capacity. And you can see this in the number of one-way trips that there are. Even the fact that we talk about lanes in transportation suggests we don't understand that actually there's tons of opportunity, let's say, to connect one load to another. And that really has led to a huge amount of market-wide inefficiency and waste and a kind of boom and bust, which characterizes this acceleration of transportation rates and then a crash in them. Let's go on to the next slide. So when we think about fragmentation, I don't think this will be a surprise to anybody. But North American carriers have quite small numbers of trucks, and it's even, actually the industry is even more fragmented in Europe. Road freight itself, and this is why it's important, constitutes a significant amount of global logistics, and it's very, very fragmented. And one of the results of this, we talked about it, the one-way trips, is there's a lot of empty road miles. Now, in some jurisdictions in Europe in particular, there are regulations against that. But I anticipate as people think more and more about their carbon footprint, they're going to be wondering about those empty road miles and how they could do a better job around that. Let's go on to the next one. I think one of the things that's really exacerbating all of this is the trend towards drop shipping. So we've seen obviously e-commerce take off tremendously. And one of the temptations there has been to say, I won't own any of the inventory. I'll just have it drop shipped. And what that's really doing is transferring the risk from the retailer to the shipper. And that has, I think, exacerbated all the problems that we've seen here. So drop shipping is complicating things. Let's move on to the next one. And beyond that, we're seeing a huge rise in shipper penalties. So the shippers themselves, and I'm thinking particularly here around consumer goods, there's been a massive M&A. So cheap money, low interest rates have driven a boom in M&A. What that hasn't necessarily done is help them to consolidate the shipment. So you might be supplying a major retailer, but supplying it from one or two legacy factories. And how easy is it for you to consolidate those shipments? Not very easy unless you can virtualize your fleet, virtualize your yard, virtualize your ASNs. Very hard to do. So we're seeing a massive deductions and penalties. Incidentally, we have data that shows that's led to a huge rise in number of people working in accounting just to generate the penalties, to dispute them, and finally to pay them. And we're seeing also, I talked about consolidation rules, but we're seeing lots of challenges around retailers' early and late fines as well. That if you're given a particular slot, if you get there early or late, get a fine for that too. And what's the reason for that? It's the lack of transparency and the lack of optimization around the routing that you have for the vehicles. Let's go on to the next one. And we've seen, earlier in the year, we saw spot rates increasing enormously. Now, of course, they've crashed. What's all that about? It's very symptomatic of an industry that is unsophisticated, is fragmented, and lacks automation and technology to be able to virtualize its capacity and, more importantly, to anticipate what demand is going to be, to match demand in advance to capacity. And it's why you see so much emphasis on spot rates, and at one end and at the other end at an annual RFP, and a concentration really on the rate card. And that's really what leads to this boom and bust all the time in transportation. Let's go on to the next one. So what should large shippers be really considering? What should they do about all this? So let's look at the next slide. Well, in the first place, there have been some technologies to help them try and tame this. And some people have invested, for example, in supply chain control towers. We did some investigations into this. One of the things that we found was troubling about this, people had spent a fair amount of money on it, but they only work really within purchase order lead time. And by the time you're within your transportation order lead time or your purchase order lead time, it's too late really to fix the problems you have around capacity and demand. So those can help, let's say, in a short-term horizon, but for a medium-term planning, not so helpful. Let's go on to the next. What we have seen, though, is that there are modern technologies which are beginning to transform transportation. So one of the things that we're seeing is a move away from the traditional transportation management, which was really all about freight audit and about the rate card. And we're seeing much more interest, particularly in cloud technologies, in embedded AI, and in the ability to share capacity more sensibly through a transportation grid, to anticipate what you need and to match your capacity in advance. We're seeing this throughout supply chain, not just in transportation, but it's in transportation where you see, I'd say, the most acute need for it. Let's go on to the next one. And we're seeing some shippers beginning to integrate their S&OP process with transportation planning and execution. Now, this sales and operations planning is something which has helped immensely for companies within their four walls, help them to anticipate their demand and to synchronize production capacity with it. And now more and more of them are synchronizing their suppliers as well by sharing this data, and now also using that same data to synchronize their transportation plan and to share it, by the way, with their carriers. So the carriers have the same kind of visibility that their other suppliers do into anticipated peaks and troughs in demand. Let's go on to the next one. And one of the main things around this is that we're seeing people beginning to use this forward view of demand to try and balance really the choice that they have between contract transportation and spot transportation at the moment, because they have little view into demand and because they're not considered perhaps in transportation to be strategic. There's a very high amount of contract transportation, and of course that introduces more uncertainty and more instability into the whole process. So one of the things that we're seeing is people using this kind of visibility and the grid to help them balance their contract and spot. And that means that they're able to exploit opportunity for backhaul and for more rational, I'd say, routing or routing of vehicles so that they don't just go along a lane and then come back again. And also the ability to match the type of transportation to the type of load and to plan in advance for predictable loads and perhaps for seasonality. So I work with lots of people who know what their seasonal load is going to be and who know that they have predictable loads every Tuesday. They go from here to there. And so what they're beginning to do is to match that to their anticipated demand and to build that in, that predictability in both to their own operations, but perhaps more importantly to their carriers as well. And what's that doing? It's reducing the overhead of spot market. When you buy on the spot market, there's an overhead there. You're paying for urgency, and you're paying for all that wasted capacity. And what they're trying to do is to use that overhead for a genuine crisis and not to use spot for everything. Most importantly here, they're reducing the risk of rejected tenders. The old idea of an annual tender and building the risk, offloading the risk onto the carrier has resulted in a lot of them just rejecting the tenders. Let's go on to the next one. So we've seen in all kinds of industries that moving to the cloud, injecting digital technologies, exploiting data from sensors, and also data that we have that will help us anticipate demand, it's enabled us to move to a more dynamic value system. So I see that throughout my supply chain research and increasingly now in transportation as well. So moving from a kind of command and control, which has led to the sort of instability we've got, to a more networked and shared or collaborative approach is what will drive us forward to a dynamic value ecosystem. Let's look at the next slide. And many of you will be familiar with all these kind of these laws like Moore's law and so on. We've seen that throughout both physical, but now increasingly a digital world, that this idea to network and to share insight and analytics is driving ecosystem return. So we know, of course, that it will enable us to achieve much greater, much better utilization of vehicle capacity, matching the right vehicles to the right loads at the right time, but also to the drivers. And importantly, in our research, that's one of the things that will help to boost the earnings of drivers and return them in the industry. They only earn when they're driving. And because of the shambolic state in which the transport industry is, because of this prevalence of contract, of spot rather than contract transportation, the uncertainty of their lives is, undermining the quality of their life, but most importantly, undermining their earnings as well. Let's go on to the next slide. This is an example of some work that we did with a client in the Far East. And by the way, I'd say Asia Pacific is well advanced in understanding this, in understanding how to gather this sensor data, how to digitize the infrastructure but also how to virtualize it and how to apply advanced technologies, typically machine learning and AI, to help them not just track the assets, but also to virtualize the assets, the fleet, the orders and the order status, the drivers and the amount of miles that they still have left. So all that kind of stuff can be moved into a platform or a grid that enables a more rational use of physical resources of plant and machinery, but also of people, and a more effective resolution of order status, so better customer service and more transparency in the end. Let's go on to the next one. So some of the things that are driving this idea of participation in marketplaces or grids, one of the things we saw definitely during COVID was that people stopped making purchases directly through representatives. They also really wound down on using RFP. So B2B companies themselves and carriers are no exception in this. They're looking for much more effective routes for market than personal selling or responding to requests for quotation. So one of the things we saw during COVID is accelerated participation in grids and marketplaces. And you can see that B2B marketplaces are already growing very, very fast. And those vertical marketplaces are proliferating even faster than the horizontal ones. Let's go on to the next slide. So what we're seeing is that shippers are beginning to take advantage of this. They're prioritizing workload planning and using real-time tendering rather than an annual RFP. So why real-time? So that they're able to use all that spare capacity and able to make better use of all the assets and drivers that are available. One of the things that they're trying to prioritize in terms of their workload planning is to use the same carrier for these recurring workloads. Why? Because it improves quality. The driver knows the peculiarities of the location that they're going to. They're trying to balance spot and contract, as we just talked about. That works wonders for your costs, but also for utilization. And it's true, people sometimes say to us, but the contracts are unenforceable. True, but this kind of collaboration boosts transparency and efficiency. It's a win for both sides, for the shippers and for the carriers. So shippers are often using digital brokerage services to balance that spot versus contract. And one of the things that we're seeing also is that we talked about the boom and bust because of the mismatch of capacity. Annual RFPs just don't anticipate that. And that's why so many people reject them. Whereas continuous tendering adapts to that disruption. If we got spare capacity, then maybe we will accept a lower bid. Or perhaps if we know we can anticipate, we can have a, a, a blip in demand during summer, we can anticipate that as well. Let's go on to the next one. So let's catch a glimpse of what the future of supply chain might look like. On to the next one. Well, one of the things is seeing continuous supply networks generally replanning the pattern of demand. Why do I say that? I talked about e-commerce. In my very early life, when I was first working as an operations research analyst, I used to do what we called facility location, looked at the center of gravity of demand. We used to lease trucks and warehouses for 3 years. That would never work now because the pattern of demand is changing all the time. Why? Partly because we have e-commerce, but partly because the variety of things that we provide to people and the channels through which we provide them has grown so enormously and is continuously changing. So that supply network optimization needs to be continuously replanned. And with it, you need to think about, well, how will my transportation needs change now? The balance between what we used to call trunking, the large trucks, and distribution, the small trucks, that's changing all the time. It means you need to do some kind of continuous tendering around that too. I already talked about the idea of integrating sales and operations planning with your operations. People are doing it with their warehouses and doing it with their transportation, just as they do with their suppliers and with their own manufacturing plants. And what's important about that is balancing the contract and spot rate transportation, as we discussed, and participating in digital marketplaces that boost this transparency for the carrier and the shipper. So let's move on to the next one. I talked a little bit already about this idea of continuously replanning the network. I often show this this diagram because people recognize that they've baked in bad decisions really in the network that they have. They baked in poor service to their customers, but they've often baked in some challenges around transportation too. Let's move on to the next one. So in this kind of network collaboration world, you can boost resilience because collaboratively you're sensing and responding to change. And if you're continuously bidding on your transportation, that helps you to adapt as well. Let's go on to the next one. We recently did a survey of 600 of our users, and we looked at what they were doing about manufacturing, smart manufacturing, agility, and you can see introducing things like digital twin to help them respond more effectively. But to do that, you've really got to have smart supply chain too. And on the next slide, we can see that when we interviewed people for this research, one of the things that they were disinvesting in or divesting in was that traditional transportation management, that focus on the freight audit, focus on the rate card. But what were they investing in instead? You can see they were investing in delivery networks or grids that enabled them to virtualize the fleet, virtualize the yard, and continuously bid on the continuously changing loads and consignments and destinations. Let's go on to the next one. And one of the things that we've seen about that, I talked, do you remember right early on about supply chain control tower and order management, that once you're at that stage, you've got no flexibility. It's a bit too late. But at the master scheduling level, so when you schedule a factory, but also when you introduce a virtualization of your transportation, so you can master schedule your transportation orders, at that point you have moderate flexibility. And then you have high flexibility when you're deciding what bids to accept and not accept. Let's go on to the next one. How to get started on your transportation transformation. I think the first thing is to think about the technology that will support the kind of virtualization and grid that you need. You'll need to think about the processes that at the moment, perhaps the process is that you don't tell your transportation people until immediately when you need something delivered. Well, you might want to start bringing them into the S&OP process so that they can have some forewarning of what the changes in demand might be and to share that with their partners as well. You'll need some governance around it to make sure that the way in which you manage your transportation suits the rest of your business strategy. And that brings me to talking about culture, that there'll need to be a change in culture, because the culture very much is around what's the price or the cost of transportation. Actually, that isn't helpful for this new and more flexible world. It should be much more around value. We saw this idea of using the same carrier, perhaps for the same route or route, because it increases the value to your customer because the service is better. And what else will you need? You definitely need to generate some insights out of this to continually retune and to continually bid on the changing pattern of demand. So you'll need to embed, yes, sensor data, but other data as well, perhaps, demand anticipation data. And you'll need to apply some machine learning and AI to that to generate actionable insights that will inform the way in which you manage these continuous bids. And finally, you'll need a strategy around this, which says, how much of this do we need to own and how much do we need to outsource? And what does that really mean for not just for cost, but for the value to our end customer? What transparency do we provide? And what transparency do our carriers in turn provide to them to boost the level of service? Because it's not just, is it delivered? It's how much certainty do they have about it and how is it delivered? Let's go on to the next one. So what might you do? First thing is to coach colleagues on the carrier value rather than cost, to continuously replan the network for sustainability and resilience. That sustainability is going to be big about not running empty truck miles, and resilience about anticipating what demand is going to be and matching it to this networked supply. Integrating your sales and operations plan And using transportation networks to reduce waste, that's a very important one. And a small commercial break, you might want to take our supply network maturity self-assessment, which if we go on to the next one, I think you'll find here in the list of reports that I pulled in order to put together this short presentation. Incidentally, if you want any of these, you can just let me know. My contact details are on the next slide, and I'd be very happy to share those with you. So thank you very much for listening to me. And now, Greer, I'm going to pass back to you.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much for taking us through your research, George. It's really helpful to see what you're finding in the industry and how that applies to what shippers and others in industry are working on. Now we're going to hear from Anshu from Leaf Logistics. He's going to take us through his understanding of also some of the underlying causes and some new approaches to managing through this uncertainty. Great.
Thanks, Greer. And just thank you, George, for setting the context. Some of the structural reasons that George described certainly resonate with what we're seeing in the work we've been doing, not just at Leaf, but for some of us who've spent the bulk of our careers in supply chain and transportation. Where we're experiencing a lot of frustration from shippers that we work with is the planning cycle and the dynamism that George talked about is not really well matched with the annual RFP cadence that many companies follow. So trying to plan out what are fundamentally decisions that are taken and then changed and enacted over much shorter planning horizons, trying to plan that out a year or 15 months in advance has left shippers vulnerable to volatility. Our industry does experience a ton of volatility, and we've all lived that roller coaster, not just in the pandemic, but if you've been working in transportation, it's an experience that you've had many, many times over. But what's become more clear, and again, as George pointed out, the frequency of changes is increasing. So the impact of that volatility gets felt much more acutely, and certainly during the pandemic, I think we can all relate to that. And part of what exacerbates this is the transactional contracting execution, the tendering 48 to 72 hours in advance. It really focuses not just the shipper demand, but also the carrier and broker capacity towards very, very short windows. So the idea of connecting something becomes very, very difficult in practical terms to do. So we'll see, our emphasis at Leaf has certainly been to try to use these different streams of data that are online and are available now more so than they were even 5 or 10 years ago, to apply analytics to those data to understand how you can coordinate one load with another. Yes, many of us have worked very hard in our careers to try to find those backhauls and continuous moves. And we can do that systematically with the tools that are available now applied over top of these data. But literally just coordinating an inbound shipment of supply materials or packaging with outbound goods from a CPG isn't just good for the carrier because they get the truck better utilized or the driver more loaded miles, but it's better for both of those shippers, the CPG company and the packaging company, because they're getting a reliability and that predictability that George talked about. Coordinating multi-shipper moves is something we're seeing happening at scale. And that has brought a lot of certainty, even without, putting too many strictures in some of the contracts. And certainly we've seen that being folded into agreements more and more so with digital contracting tools. But even without that contractual stipulation, once there's something in it that actually makes life better for the carrier or the driver to have two loads stitched together, supply has a reason to be more reliable, as does then demand the reliability to know that capacity will be there when we need it. So just contracting with certainty is really a win-win for both sides over longer and longer time horizons. We're seeing even out as far as a year with some of the seasonal peaks and troughs. Someone's peak is someone else's trough, and now all of a sudden the truck and the driver are much better off, kind of not having to wonder what the next week will bring. And this is really primarily the emphasis we place at Leaf is coordinating the grid allows us to work across. We've worked across now 450 odd different shipper data sets. We're seeing an opportunity to stitch together over 90% of transportation moves, one load with at least another. And that makes a fundamental difference in empty miles Empty miles are not helping anyone. Certainly the shippers with sustainability goals are looking to understand the tools to reduce the carbon emissions that this industry unfortunately is subject to. Well, empty miles and eliminating them is one of the most direct, most significant ways that we can start impacting the emissions intensity of our industry. But it also drives a lower cost. One of the shippers we work with that has a huge emphasis on sustainability, the transportation team thinks of empty miles as just inefficiency, kind of like how we used to think about in manufacturing and thought about safety as an important thing, because if you don't have safety, a lot of other things go wrong in manufacturing. Well, wasted miles are driving costs. They're reducing service reliability. And fundamentally, if our LSPs or logistics service providers are not generating more revenue, if the drivers aren't being paid in a reliable and consistent manner, they turn over, and any kind of turnover leads to volatility, and that starts to then again impact service and cost. This is an example of some of the work that we've been systematically doing over the last few years. Stitching together loads from multiple shippers, we're able to reduce empty miles in a very meaningful and quantifiable way. That drives cost savings, it improves service performance, the things that shipper logistics professionals are measured on. But it's also incredibly driver friendly to know that not only are your empty miles being minimized, mathematically, we're working the algorithm such that we're minimizing empty miles, but even those reduced empty miles, the driver is being paid, and he or she knows that on a predictable schedule, they're going to be back at their domicile, back at home. Those types of things that, outside of our industry, people assume just happens. But if you're kind of planning 24, 48, 72 hours at a time, it's pretty hard to do things like this repeatably, systematically. That's where some of the data coming together and really coordinating across the grid is starting to have a much more fundamental impact. And we're seeing, again, an applicability of these types of techniques across something like 90% of the freight that's out there. And the frequency with which these decisions are taken and reevaluated, and George talked about this, the need for regularly replanning and reoptimizing. Fundamentally what the truck does before it picks up your freight and what it does after dropping off your freight is not the shipper's problem. We get that. But unfortunately, we live in an interconnected industry, and it actually does significantly impact you if the truck in the load prior to you coming to pick up yours was delayed. And consequently, if there is uncertainty for, we're asking you to deliver this to point X in the map, what am I going to do with my truck and driver from point X to kind of keep that truck and driver busy? If there's uncertainty there, the reliability that you're going to experience changes. Well, we're seeing that shifting picture across the grid now with $27 billion worth of data. It becomes a much more complex mathematical problem. And so the tools that we've kind of developed have shown us now, as we start to look at historical data sets, continuous reoptimization of that picture, figuring out what's right and optimal for one shipper in the context of the grid, one LSP in the context of the grid. If you do that replanning weekly versus trying to do it annually in this particular example, when we ran this study, just the difference being able to plan it weekly reduces the overall cost by 16%. So just adjust, what we call adapt here at Leaf, really important to appreciate the complexity of this problem and the dynamism of the industry underlying it. Again, what is outside of your supply chain, what happens up and downstream, connecting those things and reacting to them. Certainly, if anything, the pandemic has shown us the need for being able to be much more responsive to changes and bringing predictability and reliability as a consequence. And that's fundamentally what we're focused on, really knitting together multiple supply networks to coordinate a view of the grid that we all participate in, but then providing the digital tools to allow even the largest and most sophisticated shippers in our industry to plug into the grid, but also allow large, medium-sized, small carriers, brokers to plug into the grid as well, and really optimize for their business needs. Everyone is focused on serving the needs of their business, and rightfully so. But if we can find those opportunities across these vast amounts of data to coordinate, we're seeing that planning and scheduling really improves very dramatically the opportunities to coordinate. And our role as Leaf is to continue to paint a picture of how much more information can be used to plan a week ahead, a month ahead, even a year ahead. And as the periods of decision making and the planning horizon shift, again, as George talked about, putting the data in the hands of decision makers to really adapt to what is fundamentally a dynamic and always has been dynamic industry, but now with better data and tools in our hands, we can be much more dynamic in how we manage our businesses in that evolving industry landscape.
Great, thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much. Well, thank you both so much for going through your research and then what you're working on at Leaf. We wanted to open it up to some question and answers. We have a few that came in that I will present to you all. If you have any additional ones, please throw them in the window there on the webinar window. And if we don't get to your question, you can reach out to us, hello@leaflogistics.com, and we can direct your question to Anshu or George if we aren't able to get to it. Great. So this first question, it's for George. Says, you mentioned that the pandemic accelerated a lot of what's happening in our industry. But as the threat of the pandemic starts to go away, do you expect any reversal in any of these changes that folks have made?
Well, not really, I think is the answer to that. I think some people's behavior has changed forever. So we've seen, for example, a big change in shopping behavior, but we're seeing that also, I think, in the world of transportation. One of the things that really struck me was that previous to the pandemic, supply chain generally, and particularly transportation, was not a CEO issue. They just assumed that it was a commodity and it would always be there. I think it's been sort of a wake-up call that it's not a commodity, that actually it really matters to your customer service, and that availability and lead time and the quality of delivery matters a lot. So I think that's a positive thing, and think that is one of the things that tipping people away from just considering it to be, a spot market, and thinking more about, shouldn't we have more stability and reliability here?
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. We all would like to see more toilet paper on our shelves, should there be any more problems in the future.
Exactly. And it seems strange, doesn't it, on a continent that is covered in trees? How could that possibly be a problem?
Yeah, that's true. Thank you. Anshu, this one came in for you. You spoke a lot about coordination. That sounds great in theory, but doesn't it require a lot of shippers working together? This is from a shipper. We've thought about doing this years ago, but it was just too hard for us. So what's actually different now?
Yeah, and look, it's a great question. And yes, we have, many of us, tried to coordinate one shipper's network with another. I think that the two differences are, one, the data are more available to understand which connections actually drive mutual benefit much more easily. And so using the data to guide us, it turns out that in our work, we see a dramatic increase by putting the right shipper next to the shipper we're working with versus just putting much more shipper volume. So for example, we've seen the network effects that, George talked about some of the analytical frameworks that are used. We've seen the network effects of putting shipper one next to shipper two. As long as you pick the right puzzle pieces to next to each other, the network effects increase by a factor of 10 times. And you put a third shipper in, it increases again by 10 times. It's a power law by which these kind of coordination opportunities really dramatically explode. And it becomes less about lots and lots of shippers and more about the right shippers next to each other. That's one point. The second is we talk a lot about collaboration. I was recently in a conversation with a couple of shippers in a group, and they were saying collaboration is fine as long as I win the collaboration. Well, that's not really what is behind trying to. None of us are doing this altruistically. The idea of coordinating this freight together, at the end of the day, it has to benefit the companies we work for and the objectives that company has. and finding through data the right connections, but then also just making sure that the needs that primarily my company cares about, this shipper cares about the service to its customer, like most of us, in our companies do. Well, if that service to that customer can be improved by coordinating freight better, that's a business objective that lines up very well to what the company cares about. It's not collaboration for collaboration's sake. It's collaboration to win in the market in which we all compete.
Great, thank you. I see a couple more questions. This one's for George. You spoke earlier about carrier value versus cost. Can you talk more about that? How have you seen this mindset shift with shippers?
Yeah, I mean, I think just before I address that, though, I want to just latch onto what Anshu just said about the right shippers. It's a little bit like, if you think about it with Uber, if you share a cab, then what makes you the right person to share it, you're in the same location. But actually with transportation, and of course that's better because you get a lower price, but also you might get quicker service because the cab is already just up the road. But of course with transportation, it's a bit more than that. Is it the right vehicle, and does the driver have the right licenses and hours and all that kind of stuff? So it's a more complex problem. So to go back to your question, what's really changing about this in terms of people thinking about value and not thinking about cost is, I think they became acutely aware during the crisis that it's not really a commodity, that one truck mile isn't the same as another truck mile. It depends on the truck, it depends on the driver, and it depends on familiarity with the peculiarities that you have. Now, one of the things that I think Anshu already referenced was the fact that even if you manage to hit your slot on time, and that's sometimes very hard to do, even if you're an excellent driver, there are some weird things about the locations that you go to. So each DC is going to be different. It takes time to get used to it. It gets time to get used to the people. And we saw a lot of that about people in particular. I did some work with people around, could they use just marketplaces for this? There are on-demand services like Uber Freight. And they said, why didn't you use that instead? And invariably the carrier, the shippers said to me, it's because it matters to us to have the same quality of service each time and for it to be extremely reliable. They said, we depend on our customers, and they, particularly during the pandemic, they said it's not just the price of what you provide, it's the reliability that we're paying for. And yeah, the transportation is part of that.
Got it. Great. Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So if there's any more, like I said, put them in the window there, or reach out to us. We can follow up with you, and we'll send a recap as well and a replay of this after. So final question, Anshu. This is from a shipper. We've started doing mini bids, and it's helped us save money with our carriers. I'm not sure why that's really a problem. The last few years were tough on all of us, and we need to show savings right now.
Yeah, I think, going back to one of the things that George talked about, the boom and bust cycle, we've done bids for a long time in this industry. And, certainly bidding more frequently can give us a lower rate or a cost, but it might not drive that long-term value. And we've certainly seen that over the course of the work that we've been doing. But frankly, I think as an industry, I think the reduced reliance on the RFP process, that one of the data points that George shared is an indication of that. Yes, we can bid more and more often, but thinking about the other side of the table, the carrier now has less freight that they can rely on to start thinking about, utilization of the truck and building routes for their drivers. So yes, you might be able to get a lower rate on paper, but does it really materialize? Do you get the service at that rate? Do you end up paying more because you're left scrambling? Because unlike taxi cabs in major metro cities, these trucks have to, get to some strange locations and pick up at strange locations, and the service to those strange locations is just as important for our supply chains. And so it just isn't about, we'll just dial up 50 trucks in ABC town in the middle of the country on demand. If the trucks aren't there, there's just nothing that the partner can do. And so we really do think that the increased bidding frequency is going to help with the freight that truly just cannot be planned, but that's on the order of 5 to 10% of the freight. Over 90% of the freight can and should be planned, and planning it allows you to get more value as a shipper, but it also allows the LSP to have the value they need to build healthier, sustainable businesses so they can really genuinely partner with you over the longer horizon.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to jump in there, I think it also kind of ties into what George spoke about a little bit earlier on OTIF fines. So thinking through, short-term cost savings might come in the cost of total, like you might look at the total cost when you're thinking of just going purely on some savings today on the rate. Well, is that going to impact you with OTIF fines later on, and perhaps just even on a cost basis? It'll
that's certainly true. That's certainly true. And yeah, so there's the OSHA aspect to it, but I think the other thing is that, and Anshu just said this, really, boom and bust is waste. You're always paying for more capacity as an industry than you need, or not having the capacity you need to satisfy your customers. So it would be better if you could just anticipate and synchronize the capacity with the expected demand. And to do that, you have to share data with the carriers so that they can, if they need to acquire more vehicles, they need to have the certainty to do that. And given that in North America, I think 40% of vehicles are owner operated, that's a substantial mortgage that they have to take on. To do that, they need to, have some visibility forward and some certainty.
Yeah, and just one small point I just wanted to tack on. In those boom and busts, it's very tempting to just react. Unfortunately, in a boom or a bust, one side of the market tends to overreact. And so when you see sort of these wild swings, and we certainly saw them in the pandemic, we also saw them in 2018 and 19 in the US in the trucking market. When there is a boom or a bust, the overreaction exacerbates the problem, makes the pain more acute. So instead of kind of following the herd, doing something that actually drives that longer term value and that customer sort of centricity. I mean, the OTIF fines, the penalty is painful, but it's maybe even more painful to think that your key customer who you're delivering to doesn't like your service, and you might lose business as a result. So those types of things that have long-term impacts on your business should outweigh, I think, the temptation to just react to, hey, maybe there's a slightly cheaper rate I can get this week, robbing Paul to pay.
Doesn't matter how much you reduced your freight costs if the customer says no thanks, we're going somewhere else.
Exactly.
Great. Well, thank you all. Really appreciate both your time talking to everybody here, and thank you everyone who joined us on the line as well. We'll follow up with the recording if you'd like to rewatch this or share with a colleague. And again, just reach out to us here at this email address if you have any further questions. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.